that this land always was and always will be First Nations land, and to realise that we're all coming together and speaking about social and environmental justice, and that really does start with First Nations justice. Because if we don't acknowledge the fundamental truth that First Nations peoples have lived on this country for 60, 70, 80,000 years in a culture that understood the rhythms, the strengths, the vulnerabilities of this landscape, and have the longest continuous culture on the planet. You know, a culture that makes the pyramids seem like very recent inventions. What an extraordinary opportunity it is to work with First Nations peoples. And I'm continued to be humbled by the fact that First Nations peoples welcome us onto their country, despite 2.5 centuries of violence and dispossession. And that is continuing. And we should acknowledge that's continuing. We should also acknowledge the richness of a culture that, despite that, continues us to welcome us onto the country. So this land always was and always will be. There's a reason I put my hand up to run for the Greens in this particular election. I have spent the last 11.5 years as a state MP. And one of the reasons I got into state politics is I looked at the state of state politics, and I don't know if you remember back in 2007, 8, 9 and 10, this sort of collapse of integrity at a state level. ICAC inquiry after ICAC inquiry, scandal after scandal. And I would complain regularly to members of my party, the Greens. I said, it's terrible state politics. And they said, well, stop complaining and get in and fix it. And that's partly what we're doing here today. Not being bystanders in democracy, but coming in and insisting that this is a collective job to come and fix the broken democracy we have. And I've got to tell you, federal politics at the moment, the pretend competition we're seeing between the Coalition and Labor is a demonstration of politics being pretty fundamentally broken at a federal level. And we feel it in our day-to-day lives. But we also know that that same technology, based on fossil fuels, is directly harming the planet. And we saw Richard set out in detail just how damaging that is and how narrow the window is now to transition in an orderly, sensible, structured way to a really positive alternate future. Because what if dealing with the climate catastrophe, which we're facing, and I'm sure many of you have seen the images, we must have seen the images from Lismore, and the thought that like tens of thousands of fellow Australians have been just savaged by a climate-induced flooding extreme event. And I caught up with some of my friends from Lismore. They just had a few days out of it, came back to Sydney for a couple of days break. And they kind of, in a hurt, broken way, were saying, you know, these used to be called 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 year events. And they said it turns out in Lismore it was 1 every 30 days because it came back and whacked them again just 30 days after. And we've all seen the damage that the fires did. Those Black Summer fires, and that was on a little island, you know, off Brooklyn, while those fires were coming down just after Christmas. And we all remember the kind of livery-coloured sky and the ash falling and the sense of doom and fearing where the fire front was going. That was climate-induced extreme weather events. We've lived through them, and I would have thought that those events, if nothing else, would change federal politics and make Labor and the Coalition wake up and realise this cannot continue. Business as normal, business as usual is literally threatening our very existence on the planet. And both of them have policy positions committed to opening up at least another 114 additional coal, gas and oil projects. Both committing to more of that. And indeed, worse still, using our public money, using tens and hundreds of millions of our public money, like 50 million just for the Beetaloo Basin, to actually open up new coal and gas projects and make the situation worse. Now, how broken is politics that it's delivering that kind of pretend competition and pretend solution? Well, it's very broken because we know that both of those parties' campaigns is funded by corporate Australia and particularly funded by the fossil fuel industries. They get the best democracy they can purchase, which is delivering for them. And then we have the absolute arrogance of those two parties that are polling each of them about 1/3 of the electorate saying that they might support them, saying that they deserve absolute control over the next parliament. Well, they bloody well don't. And I think the very best thing we can be aiming for after this federal election is a functioning working parliament, which means a minority parliament, which means whichever of those two form government, and I'm very clear about this, we will be supporting a Labor minority government, they need to persuade a majority of MPs about the common sense about their policy. They need to be subject to the power of a progressive crossbench in both houses of parliament to actually break that awful deadlock. And that is what we should be doing. It is getting to net zero by 2030. Getting to a 75% reduction in emissions by 2030 and 100% renewables by 2030. That is extremely achievable. That means shutting down coal-fired power stations in the Central Coast and in the Hunter and getting to 100% renewables by 2030. It means getting to net zero by 2035. And it means spending the next decade ending the thermal coal industry in Australia and ending thermal coal exports. A little bit longer for metallurgical coal because we don't yet have the mature technology to make steel at the scale we need without using metallurgical coal. But ending the metallurgical coal industry by 2040 and a surge of public investment in green steel technology at the same time. But one of the things I'm most proud about the Greens policy that we're taking in that transformation agenda is we have a job-for-job guarantee for coal miners in coal-dependent communities. And that's a job-for-job guarantee that will go for a decade once their coal job ends.